Hello everyone, and welcome to the West Virginia Humanities Council Little Lecture. My name is Joe Peyton, and today I'll be speaking on East Enders, architectural heirlooms in Charleston's oldest neighborhood. A little bit about myself before I begin. I am the incoming president of the Board of Directors for the West Virginia Humanities Council, formerly served on the program committee, and have been a long-time recipient over the years of programming, grant funding, and other activities of the council. And the council does good work and will continue to do good work, we hope, well into the future, including and during the current crisis, as we know, the pandemic that is sweeping the world as we speak, which is why I'm coming to you remotely today instead of live at the council headquarters. Let's begin at the beginning of the development of the East End and of Charleston. One of the first families of the area were the Ruffners. The Ruffner family arrived here in the 1790s. The first of the Ruffners to set foot and lay eyes on the Kanawha Valley would be Joseph Ruffner, his wife Anne. They were originally from Luray, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, or Luray, I think as folks in Virginia pronounce it. And they purchased 500 acres at the mouth of Campbell's Creek, just upstream, upriver from Charleston a few miles. They acquired that land from John Dickinson. The next year, 1795, Joseph Ruffner moved his family here to the Kanawha Valley to take up residency on the acreage that he acquired. Within 5 years, Joseph had acquired over 1,000 acres of the original George Clendenin family land, which covered downtown Charleston pretty much all the way to today the town of Malden, which is upstream again, up the Kanawha River from Charleston about 5 miles or so. In 1803, the patriarch Joseph Ruffner died, and his lands were divided among his heirs, first his wife Anne, and then she passed away. Their son Daniel acquired the property, which today we know is the East End of Charleston. It would have been the central portion of that large 1,000+ acres. And if you, on the slide that I have up currently, the survey that we're talking about, the land that the Ruffners acquired is 1,030 acres on the east bank of the Elk River and the Kanawha, where the two rivers converge. In 1844, Daniel, who acquired the property in the early 1800s and turned into, along with several of his brothers, prominent salt makers here in the Kanawha Valley, and in fact gained a national reputation for salt making. Daniel, his first wife had passed away, and he remarried, moved to Ohio, in turn gave his lands to his children to divide up accordingly. And the East End would be part of that parcel, of course. The next major event in the valley would be the creation of the state of West Virginia in 1863, with Wheeling as the capital. Wheeling, as everyone probably knows, is in the northern panhandle, far from the bulk of the state and the bulk of the population, which would create a problem later in terms of development of the state's resources. Interestingly, between 1870 and 1885, the capital of West Virginia becomes what's known as the floating capital, because the capital moves first from Wheeling to Charleston in 1870. Charleston was still a very small village, then back to Wheeling in 1875, then permanently to Charleston in 1888, which really launches the development of Charleston and the East End as well. This slide shows what Charleston looked like in the 1850s. This is an image from an 1854 painting taken from across on the south side of the Kanawha River, looking into the heart of downtown Charleston. The population of the city or the town at the time was just over 1,000, and Charleston did not have a railroad. It was strictly a river town. It had several turnpikes that came through the East End, in fact, and elsewhere. Now, if we start looking at the architectural heirlooms in the area on the East End, there are currently 5 antebellum properties that still exist on present-day Kanawha Boulevard, what formerly was known as Kanawha Avenue. They have not all been in their current locations, but 3 of the 5 have been. And again, looking at the slide, number 1, and these numbers will be important, I'll show you a map in a moment. Number 1 is the 1815 property of Daniel Ruffner, built in 1815. We know it in this area as Holly Grove, and it sits right next to the governor's mansion on the Capitol lawn area. It is built in the Federal and Classical Revival style. What's interesting is today when you see Holly Grove, it looks like a grand southern mansion. When it was originally built, it did not have the large portico in the front. It was more simple, in keeping with the style of the day, known as Federal, and then later, when Classical Revival became popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s, many residences in the East End and elsewhere added columns, added portico, added classical details, such as Holly Grove. Number 2 is the circa 1800 Ruffner cabin, which used to sit on Kanawha Boulevard and was dismantled in the 1970s, moved, and currently stands in Daniel Boone Park, just east of town. Number 3 is the Augustus Ruffner House, built in 1834, which most people are not aware it exists because it is a relatively non-pretentious home, brick home built in the Federal style with Italianate details, and it stands at 1506 Kanawha Boulevard, where it has always been since it was constructed in 1834. Number 4 is the house in which we are currently standing, and I'm giving you the lecture, and that is the McFarland Hubbard House, constructed in 1836 on Kanawha Avenue as one of the premier estates of the antebellum era. Number 5 is the Craig Patton House, known as Elm Grove, which currently sits adjacent to the Ruffner cabin in Daniel Boone Park, but it originated in downtown Charleston, then was moved later, and then finally, we hope its final resting place in Daniel Boone Park. And it is a Greek Revival structure. This map depicts the 5 properties that I just referred to, and Kanawha Boulevard, which historically was known as Kanawha Street, follows the Kanawha River. It was originally part of the James River and Kanawha Turnpike, which began on the Atlantic coast of Virginia and stretched to the Ohio River and then later beyond. Number 1, this is Holly Grove that I just referred to. Number 2 refers to where the Ruffner cabin used to stand. Number 3 is the Augustus Ruffner House. Number 4 is the McFarland Hubbard House, again, where we are today. And then number 5 is the original site of the Craig Patton House, Elm Grove, before it was moved. And for reference, those who are familiar with the streets of Charleston, Capitol Street is marked, Bradford Street, Ruffner Avenue, and Greenbrier Street. This map is an early map of Charleston after Charleston was incorporated, and the city limit, the town limit at the time in the 1870s when this map was made, was at Bradford Street. If you went east of Bradford Street in what today would be the heart of the East End residential district, it was a series of farms, many of which owned by the Ruffner family and several other prominent landowners. The state capital after 1885 was this area here on Capitol Street. Not surprising that our state capitol was on Capitol Street, which is why Capitol Street is so named. And the distance from Bradford to downtown Charleston would be about 1 mile. So very easy traveling distance, walking, by horseback, by cart, wagon, later streetcar, and bus. If we look at this slide, you can see that something happens in Charleston in the 1890s, between the 1890s and the 1930s. Charleston booms. It's the formative years of the city of Charleston, and accordingly, the East End really blossoms as the prime residential neighborhood for the entire city. The slide that I show you here is a circa 1890 image of the state capitol on Capitol Street and the Ruffner Hotel to the left on the boulevard or on Kanawha Street at the time. One of the keys to the development of the East End is the advent of public transportation. Charleston got its first horse-drawn streetcars in 1888. Not an odd time for a town of this size to begin getting public transportation, public transit. It was a nationwide trend, and the late 1880s was about the time that many other cities and towns across the country would acquire their first streetcars. Initially, ours were horse-drawn, as many were, and by 1898, the system was electrified, later extended, and in the city, there were 3 primary streetcar routes, which helped the East End develop. The slide that you see here shows a streetcar stop at the corner of Ruffner and Virginia Street. This is right before the end of the streetcar era in the 1930s, and then the bottom slide just below that is that same scene taken just a few months ago. And then also in the upper right-hand corner, about a year or 2 ago, I was traveling on Ruffner Avenue, and I happened to look, and a pothole had opened up. Usually I curse when I see potholes, but this one exposed a piece of the original brick pavement and a section of the trolley line, the track, which is still there. And I can remember the tracks as a kid still being there. No streetcars, but the tracks are all still there. The 3 loops that Charleston would open up were named Inner Loop, Middle Loop, Outer Loop. Very creative. And the East End neighborhood develops along the streetcar line. These are the 3 lines color-coded. Inner Loop being red, it just ran through downtown. The Middle Loop went a little bit farther. It went all the way to Ruffner Avenue before it looped back to Capitol Street. And then the Outer Loop covered a big majority of what today is the heart of the East End, went all the way to Duffy Street, which no longer exists. Duffy Street was removed to construct the Culture Center in the 1970s. And then the state capitol, of course, was moved in the 1920s after a great fire in 1921 destroyed the Capitol Street Capitol. The East End was chosen as a location for the new state capitol, where the Capitol still is today. Let's look specifically at the development of the East End now, kind of giving you the overview and the 30,000-foot view. Let's hone in to the ground level. Development of the East End away from agricultural farms, and indeed many of them were slave plantations, including the Ruffner's operations. They operated their farm with slave labor, as did many property owners along Kanawha Avenue and outlying areas. Between the 1830s and the 1880s, individuals, mainly industrialists, successful business people, salt makers, began building stately homes along Kanawha Street, along the turnpike, which was the main overland route for travel in this area. And they also had a commanding view of the Kanawha River, which may not have been that attractive in the 1800s, because the Kanawha was known, especially around Malden where the salt works were, was known as Old Greasy because of the dirt and the pollution and the grime. A lot of the salt makers built their homes along Kanawha Street to avoid the dirt and the grime and what was characterized at the time as the undesirable elements of Malden, of the salt works, which you could construe that to mean the pollution, but as well probably the African-American labor that was enslaved there. And because Charleston is downriver but upwind from Malden, because our prevailing winds go from the west to the east, Charleston would have been a safe and much cleaner environment to build a palatial home rather than on the outskirts of Malden, going the other way. In 1895, the heirs of Daniel Ruffner, his children, and in some cases grandchildren, began to divide their lands for development. No longer would it be profitable we're nearly in the 20th century now, to have an agricultural operation, but profit and development would drive what was going to happen next, and that is the division of the East End into building lots. Interestingly, we claim, because no one has refuted that claim, that in Charleston we have the longest city blocks in the world. Most people say Virginia Street is the longest city block in the world. Well, you could add to that Canal Boulevard, Virginia, Courier Street, Lee Street, and the southern half of Washington Street. And I have actually gone online and looked to see if there are longer blocks in the world. I have not found definitive evidence that there is anything longer, but somewhere in Australia in the outback there is a so-called street or a block that goes for hundreds of miles. Not sure that counts, but nevertheless, those blocks are nearly half-mile long. I live on Virginia Street, and I can get a 1 mile walk or run when I used to run, and it would almost be from door to door. If I go all the way around the block and go to either the Boulevard or Courier Street, it's almost exactly 1 mile long. And the reason that those blocks are so long is when the Ruffners divided their holdings, they did not include cross streets in that area. And they did that on purpose, not because it was an oversight. And when the city finalized that grid and began to kind of accept that as the norm, the city never added any cross streets. So therefore, we have these really, really long blocks. Now, the East End today, if you travel through the East End, you see an amazing collection of very stylish homes, in addition to some more modest homes in other areas. Those stylish homes, when they were built in the 1800s and early 1900s, reflected the social standing of the residents who built them and the folks who lived in them. And over time, if you had an East End address, it would become the most desirable address in the city of Charleston. Because the East Enders owned businesses in town, they held executive jobs in banking and in industry. They worked for state and local government. And I jotted down a few of the prominent individuals. We had 1 U.S. Senator, 3 members of the House of Representatives, no less than 5 governors, many state and local officials, including to this day many lawmakers, have at least part-time residences in the East End of Charleston, and so do a lot of city officials. And we had 1 territorial governor of Alaska who moved here in the early 1900s. His name was Walter Clark. He eventually, I believe, became the owner of the Daily Mail, if I'm not mistaken. But his house still stands on Virginia Street, and he was the governor of Alaska when Alaska was experiencing the Klondike Gold Rush. So pretty interesting history there. Now, to this day, the East End is the city's only large group of late 19th and early 20th century architecture that survives in a large mass. The slide that you see under the East End Development heading, the one at the top depicts Canal Street, where Morris Street intersects Canal, which would be behind where I am currently speaking from. What styles were here? What architectural styles? We had practically every prominent style that was being built in the United States between the 1880s and the 1930s. No less than 12 major architectural styles. And as a general rule of thumb, you can study and look at the architectural styles and when they were built, because architecture, like fashion, like haircuts, whatever, are what's in is in, and what's out is typically not done. And same thing with architecture. You typically style your house on what is popular at the time. The East End is no exception. And you see a list here of at least 12 major architectural styles, from Greek Revival to Victorian in all of its splendor and its irregular designs, to Renaissance, different Renaissance styles, Spanish Colonial, Tudor Revival, Prairie, and a subset of that would be American Foursquare, which we have a lot of in the East End and elsewhere in Charleston as well, including at least one prominent chateau-esque structure, which looks like a French chateau. Now, where are the different building styles? The East End, remember, developed from downtown moving east. So it started, the first houses were built on the western end of the East End, closest to town, and then the East End grew from west to east. So the growth was upriver, away from downtown. So if we begin in the western section of the East End, we see the oldest buildings that still survive. They are dating again from the 1880s to the early 1900s, and they include the styles that would have been prominent at the time. And I have a list on this slide that you can see, including, again, Queen Anne, number of Victorians, which I'll show you in a minute, some eclectic styles, a little less ornate in terms of styling as you get closer to the center and then the eastern part of the East End. In the center area of the East End, near, let's say that would be west of the state capitol, you see a lot of buildings constructed between the early 1900s and 1930s, mixed in with the occasional late Victorian. And these include the revival styles, Georgian revival, some colonial revival, craftsman, bungalows, cottages, four squares, and Jacobean, even another fairly unusual style, rare style for this area. Very common, obviously, in Britain. And then the eastern part of the East End, when you get upriver from the state capitol, that is east of the state capitol, you see the prominent period from the 19-teens to 1940, right before World War II, and the styles reflect that period. Let's take a quick tour. The classic Victorians in the East End are numerous. And the slide that you see up here, if we begin going clockwise from top left, we have the McWhorter House on Bradford Street. Remember, Bradford now is in the western part of the East End. That would have been the old town limit in the 1870s originally, and you would have been out in the country pretty much once you get east of Bradford and Ruffner. The McWhorter House on Bradford Street. Bradford includes a number of late 19th century Victorians. The Woodman House, 1891 on Canal Boulevard. One of the many Ruffner houses. This one is an 1889 Ruffner house built by Meredith Ruffner, one of the extended Ruffner family and a merchant in the valley. And then the 1888 Johnson Davis home on Canal Boulevard. Other classic Victorians, the one on the left here, the James Payne house, is in the 1200 block of Virginia. Today, the 1200 block of Virginia Street is kind of a no person's land. It's between downtown development and the beginning of the East End historic neighborhood. And so there are several surviving examples of Victorian architecture that are clinging for their very life because development has encroached all around them. And that's not new development, that's development that began in the 1950s and continues to this day. Today, we tend to demolish older buildings for parking lots, which I won't comment on, but not a fan of it. But the James Payne House at 1210 Virginia is very interesting. It stands kind of alone, surrounded by two parking lots, and then more modern office development around it. The classic Victorian that you see in San Francisco, Cape May, New Jersey, many other places that are known for their outstanding Victorian architecture, looks a lot like the 1889 Stevenson Tuvey House, which stands at 28 Bradford Street. Folks who are familiar with the city might remember that this was a shocking pink color for many, many, many years until a few years ago, new owners repainted the home, again in a style or a color that was representative of the Victorian era. And I have a lot of students, because I teach history, who say that pink house is so gaudy, it's awful. And I have to tell them that is exactly the color scheme that a Victorian should be. Often pastels, polychromatic color schemes, numerous colors to bring out the textures, the layers, the various details of the property. Still looks nice, but it's no longer pink. A couple of my favorites are very small, somewhat understated residences. One is the Oscar Payne Cottage at 1508 Virginia Street. That cottage dates from 1895, and it stood originally on Canal Boulevard, Canal Street. It was moved to make way for a much larger house that still stands at 1510 Canal Boulevard, and it was picked up and pulled by oxen over one block to Virginia Street, plop back down where it stands today, and that would make a beautiful home for a growing family or retired couples. Relatively small, but it goes back a long way. It has several additions on it. Then there's another lovely Victorian cottage at 1409 Quarrier Street, built in 1907, late Victorian period, and it has a very nice color scheme as well, as you can see here. But those small cottages are surrounded often by much larger, much more ornate structures. Let's look at a few of the prominent architects that worked in the East End. Perhaps the best known of the East End architects was a gentleman named Walter Martens. Martens designed roughly 12 East End buildings that still survive. And probably his landmark building in Charleston was the 1939 United Carbon building on Canal Boulevard. When it was built in 1939 in the streamlined modern style, it was a state-of-the-art office building, headquarters for the United Carbon, later Carbon Fuel Company. And it included all the latest amenities. The Saarinen family was involved in its design, some of the interior work, and it still survives. Now, in the East End, as far as residential development, Martens built several apartment complexes in an Art Deco style, two of which I have on the slide here, both built in 1935, Cavalier Apartments and Belvedere Apartments, both on Virginia Street on the East End. Then perhaps the best known residence on the East End, although currently unoccupied, is the 1925 Executive Mansion next to the state capitol that Martens designed, built in the Georgian Revival style. And as the story goes, the architect of the state capitol, Cass Gilbert, one of the premier architects of his day in the United States, who had designed numerous state capitals, several federal buildings in D.C., apparently when he saw the governor's mansion, which was built in 1925, just as the new capitol was being built after the fire on Capitol Street destroyed our earlier capitol, apparently Gilbert was quite pleased and said that he would have designed a Georgian Revival mansion as well. So he felt that he and Martens were kindred spirits in that. He thought it was a good contrast to the state capitol. Another of the landmark buildings still in use as a woman's club is the 1929 Chateau-esque women's club at the corner of Elizabeth Street and Virginia Street. And for nearly 100 years, the women's club has owned and maintained that as their headquarters. And they rent out space as well for functions. Two more architects that you'll find in the East End are Russ Warren. And I just put two examples of his work. The 1910 Knapp Spillman House on Elizabeth Street, Colonial Revival, and the 1895 Staunton Zimmerman House, which is at 1300 Canal Boulevard. It is a neighbor to the McFarland Hubbard House here, and Warren did not design the original house. He designed a redo in the early 1900s in a more classical revival style. And he's the one that incorporated and put in the large front portico porch, which again was in keeping with the style of the day. Warren also was a founding member of the firm that today is known as Silling Associates. Still very prominent, one of the oldest in the area, if not in the entire country. Fred Crowther, who was British, he left his mark, didn't stay in Charleston for terribly long. He left his mark by building or designing Manor Place on Virginia Street. In 1922, there are 6 small homes, small Tudor Revival homes on a small cul-de-sac in the middle of the 1500 block, and they retain their original character 100 years later. Another very prominent architect in Charleston is John C. Norman, African-American from Charleston, lived on the west side. His house still survives on 2nd Avenue on the west side. Norman did not design a lot of homes on the East End, but one that we know is his stands at 1536 Virginia Street today. And the slide that I have up, you see an image of Mr. Norman. He is one of our first registered African-American architects, and in fact, a very prominent architect who worked on a variety of commercial and residential structures all over the city. The house at 1536 is unpretentious. It's very functional. It is a mid-century home, brick home, and it used to stand on Greenbrier Street near the Interstate Exchange at Greenbrier Street near the Capitol, and it was moved to the Virginia Street location when the interstate was constructed in the 1970s, and it still survives. And we have the plan for that house is now at the West Virginia Culture Center in State Archives. The Norman family gave their dad's papers, the son, John C. Jr., gave his father's papers, drawings, and much of his correspondence to the state, and all that is at the archives today. Finally, a set of brothers, the Davidson brothers. They were not architects, they were builders. John and Wayland, they built some fantastic homes in the East End, two of which include, one is the 1902 Carver House at 1516 Canal Boulevard, and it's sort of a transitional. It's characterized as Baroque eclecticism, and if you see it, it has some Victorian elements and combines that with the Baroque. It formerly had been an office complex, has recently been converted back to a single-family residence, which you don't see very often. Usually it's the other way around. And then finally, one of my favorites in terms of the front facade, the 1939, I believe that's Shadle Price House, 1511 Courier Street. It is an Italianate with a curved front bay window, which is beautiful. I was in this house, my wife and I, since we live on the East End, we like to go to estate sales on the East End so we could snoop around in people's houses. And we went to an estate sale here, bought a couple things, small things, and there is a gigantic Tiffany stained glass window on the back of the house. It catches the sun and is absolutely amazing. This slide shows some of the later constructions in terms of date, either in the central part of the East End or the eastern or the upper part of the East End above the Capitol. Starting on the left, the 1935 Lindenberg Glass House, which is Spanish colonial revival. It's now an office complex. Then we have two houses built by the Schwabe family, and longtime residents of Charleston will remember a very prominent business, Schwabe May, which was a store that began in retail that began on Capitol Street and then moved into the Town Center Mall when it opened, finally closed. But the two houses, 1612 and 1614, were built by the Schwabe family for two daughters of the Schwabes, and they are identical twins, not the daughters, but the houses. And you can still see from the slide that they are exactly the same in terms of their styling. Then we have the 1929 Lively House, which is Spanish revival. It has recently undergone a rehabilitation. Then an English Tudor revival at 1578 Virginia, the Bear Roderick House, built 1914, which includes the half timber, or it's the English Tudor style of half timber construction. And then in the center is the 1908 Capito House. Again, if you're an old timer in Charleston, you maybe donated blood here, because for about 30 years that was the American Red Cross headquarters, where you would go donate blood, where their offices were. And in the probably it would have been about 15 years ago, I think, Jarrett Construction purchased the building when the Red Cross moved out of town, and it is now the headquarters for Jarrett Construction, and they've done a remarkable job of maintaining it. In the middle of a residential neighborhood, to have a construction company operating, it's very interesting, and they do a really wonderful job. This is one of my favorite parts of the presentation, because I want to show you some views of the East End then, meaning maybe 100 years ago or so, and that same image that I recreated recently now. And you can see that many of the houses, their setting still the same, with often the exception being the trees are much larger. And in the summertime, it's difficult now to get a clear shot of many of the houses in the East End because of the beautiful greenery. This first then and now shot is Virginia Street approaching Ruffner. So it's the 1400 block of Virginia on the north side as you head up Virginia Street toward the state capitol. And we have on your left an American Foursquare. The middle house, which you cannot see in the bottom now slide, but the then slide, it was a house that was built and lived in by Addison Scott. Scott was an engineer, civil engineer, who designed the locks and dams on Kanawha River, worked with the Corps of Engineers, and it is a Spanish Revival home. And then the one you can barely see the columns is the old Myers-Haley house from the early 1900s, and it sits right on the corner of Ruffner and Virginia Street. The next slide is the Judge Ira Robinson house. This is also a Davidson Brothers construction built in the Swiss chalet style. It's on Courier Street, next to the one that I mentioned the Davidsons had designed with the curved bay window. And Judge Robinson was a judge on the West Virginia Supreme Court. And then, obviously, there's no trees to speak of. There's one small tree that, this is in the winter, I suppose, no leaves on it. But now, if you don't take a picture of this in the winter, you don't see the front of the house, but it has been well preserved. Fine residences, according to this postcard, corner of Courier and Virginia, or excuse me, Courier Street and Ruffner Avenue. And top is the postcard view, roughly 1910, and the bottom is 2020, over 100 years later. You'll also notice on the East End homes, you see very few fences. Actually, there should not be any fences in the East End Historic District because we try our best to maintain the historic integrity and ambiance of the district. And folks often will want to put in a fence for some reason. I guess they don't want to meet their neighbors, but we will dissuade them from doing so, we being the Charleston Historic Landmarks Commission. Another view, Lee Street, you also notice this postcard shows very clearly we have a lot of clay tile roofs in the East End. Wonderful roofs, their longevity is beyond dispute. However, they last about 100 years. When the roof itself might still survive another 100 years, but the underlayment often deteriorates, and so you get roof leakage. And if you do the math, many of these houses were built in the early 1900s. They're now over 100 years old. And a lot of folks are facing roof replacements now, and that can be a very costly expense these days, upwards of $80,000 to replace a clay tile or a slate roof. And we're trying to find solutions. There are synthetic materials available. Some folks just want to put up shingle, which we try to discourage on the Landmarks Commission. And another view, again, clay tile roof, wonderful view of a horse-drawn carriage and the top postcard slide and a couple of young children on the corner. Then the bottom slide, again, more trees today. And then and now's from a book. The top black and white images here are from a book titled Charleston 1907 that included a number of images, I think over 50 images of East End homes. Many of the homes still stand. Some have been altered, some have been demolished. The one on the upper left-hand image is 1204 Virginia Street, which still survives today. It's in that block of sort of lost treasures because there's a lot of modern development around the surviving heirlooms. 1204 is an office complex. The owners have done a nice job of maintaining it. 1202, its neighbor, you can see the difference. The top slide is what 1202 should look like. The bottom slide shows 1202 with the turret roof taken off and the porch, which had a wraparound porch, gone, and the entrance sealed up on the front porch. The building still survives, waiting for someone to rehabilitate it back to its original appearance. Hasn't happened yet, but maybe someday it will. Now, a quick tour of Charleston in 1920, and then some of the same scenes, the same houses that still survive today, again, a then and now, but we're going to move up the East End toward the Capitol. The top image, the black and white, is from 1920, and it is a panoramic view of Charleston taken from across Kanawha River on the south side. The first slide that you see here shows Bradford Street on the left, where I have Bradford Street labeled, and the corner of Bradford and Kanawha Street then looked like what you see on this postcard image below. Then we have two houses in that would be the 1300 block of Virginia that still survive today that I have circled on the older image. Next view, again, moving up river. We're now in the 1500 block of Kanawha Boulevard, Kanawha Street, the long block that I mentioned earlier, nearly half a mile long. The street on the left that you see is Ruffner Avenue. You can make out, you can barely see a roof line, but this is the Augustus Ruffner house, 1834. The next house, this is the house that was constructed in roughly 1905, and that's when the Payne cottage was moved back to Virginia Street that I mentioned earlier. This is now a commercial enterprise and office complex, actually. Then we have the Carter House I talked about earlier at 1516, and one of the many four squares that still survive farther up 1500 block. We're nearing the middle of the 1500 block of Kanawha Boulevard now. Another four square, this is now a law office. As we near the end of the 1500 block, several more houses, three more that still survive, 1920. A farmhouse that is still there. It is now a realtor's office. The four square in the middle is a law office. And the Garland Thayer residence of 1578. One of the reasons that residents of the East End in the 1970s launched a neighborhood preservation movement was because they were witnessing the loss of many landmark structures in the East End, either due to neglect, due to changing tastes in style and architecture, due to the growth of businesses, and other reasons. Some of the beautiful landmarks started to be demolished, including the Garland Thayer residence of 1578. I do not have a closer image of that residence. It's a bit fuzzy, you can't really see it, but I can tell you that it dates from turn of the century, and it was raised in 1966 to construct Parkside Place apartment complex, which borders Ruffner Park today. And the Charleston Daily Mail included on their city page, which was a big local section of the paper when I was young, when I was a kid, and March 23rd, 1966, turn of century home being raised, and they talk about some of the detailing, the ornate staircase, the old wood-burning stove, the leaded glass, and Parkside Place was constructed as one of the first high-rise apartments in the city, and it still survives. But some neighbors were not happy, obviously, that they're losing some of their landmarks for modern construction, especially now with a height of 8 stories, 9 stories, maybe. So the height of buildings begins to grow, as does the footprint for many of the buildings. On the corner of Kanawha Boulevard and Elizabeth Street, the two houses on the left still survive at 1596, 1598. Both are offices. This is Elizabeth Street here, named, by the way, for Elizabeth Ruffner. That was the extent of property that Elizabeth owned, hence Elizabeth Street. Same with Ruffner Avenue. That was the extent of the Ruffner holdings, so that's why it's Ruffner Avenue. 1602 Kanawha Boulevard. If you're familiar with the area, you know what's there now. It is not this house, not the residence of George Couch, a beautiful, large Victorian. It too was demolished in 1965 to make way for Trinity Lutheran Church, which was constructed in 1966. I found a newspaper article on the church construction, and This was from April of '65, talking about the old home on the site being demolished. Now, these threats and others, by the late 60s and 70s, there were several things going on nationwide that spurs historic preservation in the United States and here in Charleston. A landmark piece of legislation passed the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, which set preservation policy for the nation, which we still are abiding by, we hope, today. That included creation of the National Register of Historic Places to designate site structures and objects of national, state, or local significance through a nomination process. Also, the U.S. bicentennial was approaching. In the early 70s, folks began to pay more attention to their past, to their history, and those who are old enough remember the miniseries Roots that aired in the late 1970s about Alex Haley's family roots in Africa, and Roots broke all records for viewership of miniseries, and I think they still stand, perhaps. And it actually helped people reattach with their roots. And a lot of folks, African American, Euro American, everybody wanted to find out where they were from after Roots appeared and aired, and the book was written, of course, prior to that. And all these together and many other factors led to a nationwide historic preservation movement that touches Charleston as well. I'll talk about the state capitol being built. A lot of folks don't realize when the capitol was built in the East End, there were houses where the capitol is today. It was not an open lot. It was not a campus like we know today, but this is a slide showing the two wings of the capitol have already been built, but not the center dome. And you can see that there are houses all over the East End, many of which have already been removed by this point in time. Another of the changes to the East End would come in the 1930s, part of the New Deal, when Kanawha Boulevard was constructed. Formerly Kanawha Avenue, the old James River and Kanawha Turnpike, becomes a modern 4-lane thoroughfare through the city, meant to alleviate horrendous traffic jams in downtown Charleston, which it did, but it also took out a number of residences on the East End due to the expansion of the street to 4-lane, led to landscaping of the boulevard, of course, and these are two postcards showing the one on the upper left shows the upper East End from the old Kanawha City Bridge, or today 35th Street Bridge, looking down the boulevard to the new state capitol. And the other is a view from the Southside Bridge downtown, looking upstream at the United Carbon building. And then just beyond there somewhere is the McFarland Hubbard House in the grove of trees. Now, an interesting side note to the boulevard construction, there were 8 houses that stood on the south side of Kanawha Street on the riverbank before Kanawha Boulevard was constructed. Today there's only one building left on the riverside of Kanawha Boulevard, and that's the Union Building, which survives by accident because essentially the state ran out of money to demolish it. So they kept it. And if anyone's ever been in the Union Building, try to come out of it on the sidewalk is maybe 2 feet wide, and you're kind of sandwiched between the building and the boulevard when traffic screaming by. That's why the Union Building survives. But there were 8 residences that most of them were demolished. One was saved. It's known as the Dolly House, D-A-W-L-E-Y. And on this slide, you can see where it was. It was right at the corner of Morris, actually Brook Street, between Brooks and Morris on Kanawha Street. And the Dolly was picked up and moved to Kanawha Avenue in Kanawha City, where it still stands today. And the slide on the lower right shows the Dolly House in its current home on the riverbank on the south side of the Kanawha. And Life magazine in October of 1939 included a story about the moving of the Dolly House. The article was titled House Upriver. And when the city decided to condemn the houses, the Dolly family wanted to keep their house, so they hired a firm to move it. And an interesting note is that Mrs. E. Curtis Dolly, who was the owner of the house, said that she removed none of the furniture. All the pictures are still hanging. The piano, organ, and dishes were all moved along intact with the house. Nothing was broken. Today, we don't see houses being moved very often, mainly because the cost is just too prohibitive. In those days, it was not uncommon. And I remember, again, as a kid, when the interstate was built, a lot of houses were moved in various locations. And I think you could buy a house for $1 from the state or from the construction company, and then you had to pay for the move of the house. And today, if you did that, it would be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to move a house. Here are 9 lost treasures from the Charleston 1907 book that I mentioned earlier. These, not sure what happened to most of them, but they have been lost over the years. In many cases, on the lot today would be a modern office complex, or in some cases, parking lots. But we do have saved heirlooms. I mentioned Patton House, which has been moved. It's actually been moved twice from its original location on Dunbar Street, which today, if you're familiar with Charleston, it's near where Sacred Heart Grade School playground is. It was then moved to the 1300 block of Lee Street, and the snapshot that you see on this slide, the one above, is the Elm Grove or Craig Patton House on Lee Street, and then its current home in Daniel Boone Park. And the National Society of Colonial Dames owns the Craig Patton House. They maintain it as a house museum today. When the Capitol was built, the new Capitol, the current Capitol, again, remember I mentioned that where the Capitol stands today was a residential neighborhood, and the houses in the area where the Capitol was built, some of them were less than 20 years old. So imagine building a brand spanking new house. The state comes to you less than 20 years later, maybe 15 in some cases, or 10. Oh, by the way, we want your house. Wow, I just moved in. And some people were not happy about losing their house, obviously. 50 houses were condemned, some of the large homes like you just have been seeing. 12 were moved across the river to a development at South Ruffner, where the University of Charleston athletic field is today, by 2 developers, Brad Noyes and A.E. Young. And those 12 houses were moved to what was known as Beachview Development. They cleared a piece of land, laid in sidewalks, plumbing, and moved those houses over. The cost to move all 12 was $42,000. $3,500 per house is what the owners paid to move their houses, or whoever would buy those houses. And the company, John Eichley Jr. out of Pittsburgh, they were house movers that moved houses and moved buildings all over the United States. They paid $0 in damages to move those houses. They did no damage whatsoever. We have a really good catalog photographic collection of the houses being moved. And the slide you see here shows 2 of the houses on scaffolding on a barge being moved almost directly across Kanawha River. At least one of those houses in the image above on this slide still exists on 20th Street near the University of Charleston field where the new field has been constructed. Some of the houses have been lost over the years, but several, at least 3 still survive that I know of, including the one that you see pictured here. So very interesting. Preservation would take hold in the 70s. I mentioned that neighborhood preservation was spurred on by events happening nationwide. And in the mid-70s, there was a survey undertaken to survey historic resources in the East End. Over 550 resources were surveyed, about a 110-acre piece of ground, which would form the nucleus for the East End Historic District. A National Register nomination was done and accepted by the National Park Service. The Historic District was created in 1978, the first historic district in the city of Charleston when it was established. And in 1988, the district, which had been in existence for a decade, was bolstered with local design review being established by city ordinance. So if you live in the area that is included in the original East End Historic District boundary, before you move in and make significant changes to the exterior of your house, you must come before the Charleston Historic Landmarks Commission and state your case, state your argument for why you want to use the materials that you want to do, why you want to put siding on your house, which, by the way, we do not like siding, why you want to replace your tile roof with shingles, so on and so forth. And then in 2014, the East End, Greater East End was resurveyed, and the historic district boundary was extended another 120 acres to the north, and included another 644 contributing resources. So we have over 1,000 historic properties in the district now, and covers over 230 acres. This is the original boundary of the district, which is both on the downstream side of the state capitol. Then the Capitol complex is its own historic district. Then above the Capitol, what I call the Panhandle, I guess it would be the eastern Panhandle in this case, there is a small sliver of several streets included in the district. Then in 2014, you can see the expansion, the area depicted north of Washington Street here is the area that was added, and that area does not have design review. It is, I mean, that option could exist in the future, but that is a local action that has not yet been taken. And finally, the East End Historic District is 42 years old and going strong. It's existed since 1978. And my tagline is where architectural heirlooms abound. And I will leave you with this, yet again, a then and now image of the corner of Ruffner and Virginia Street. Thank you all very much. You'll see in parts of the East End there are a number of houses that don't maintain the same setback as many of the other properties do, or their lot is a lot larger than some of the others, including my own house on Virginia Street. Ours sits way back, and as near as I can determine, our house predated any ordinance that said you had to have an X number of foot setback. And we know our house was built by 1912, and I think it existed prior to that as maybe a support structure to another house the way it's constructed. But there are several other houses that they are sitting much farther back from the street than what you typically see when the neighborhood was developed in the early 20th century. And in some cases, some folks acquired double lots or even larger than that. In the 1500 block of Virginia, there are several residences that have very large lots, and that is why also, sadly, in recent years, within the last 12 to 15 years, one property on Virginia Street burned, and it was not reconstructed. The adjoining property owner acquired the lot and re-landscaped it into a beautiful garden space, and so they have a very large lot as well. But that is because of a fire, a fire that destroyed one of the houses. It is true that historic designations, historic districts are known, and it's quantified that property values increase, and they maintain their value when less stable neighborhoods might be decreasing in value. We see that on the East End today. Areas included in the historic district, typically residences sell for a higher price, or the asking price is higher than surrounding neighborhoods. Other benefits include stability in the neighborhood, and what you often see in the East End and elsewhere is a lot of owner-occupied residences. We do have a lot of apartment buildings in the East End built in the 1930s, 40s, and some of the old houses have been divided to apartments, but we've also seen a trend in the last 20 years or so where a lot of the residences that had been divided have been redone back into single-family houses. I mentioned one on the boulevard. So The sense of community, this is basically an anecdotal answer, but the sense of community is very strong, sense of pride in the neighborhood and in the community. And I think a lot of folks, and thankfully I'm seeing it in younger property owners now, take a real pride in knowing that they own something that intrinsically is beautiful, has an interesting history, and they really look at themselves more as stewards of the property as opposed to someone who wants to move in and put their trademark on a property. As a member of the Historic Landmarks Commission, one of the things that we try to do is educate property owners that we're just passing through, and it's our job, much like what the Humanities Council does with their house. You're very good stewards of this historic resource because you realize that someday this house is going to survive when you and I are long gone, and maybe in fact the council moves on to another property somewhere. So we've had great luck doing that, and ultimately there is a financial reward, but much of the reward can be intangible, just a feeling of sense of place and community. And it's interesting and it's nice that we don't have privacy fences everywhere, although if you look in the backyards of many of the residences on the East End. I like to snoop on Google Earth, and I go through the neighborhood and just see how large the backyards are, who has pools, who has decks on the back. We really don't govern on the Landmarks Commission what you do in your backyard if it's not a primary facade or if it's out of view from the street. And a lot of folks are erecting in recent years privacy fences in the backyard, but we've been very successful in maintaining that pedestrian level at the street level with no fences, walls, or other structures that obstruct both the view and the feeling of community and the feeling of sort of that personal contact. Interstate construction through Charleston, through the Kanawha Valley, took a tremendous toll on historic resources. And those who are familiar with the story know that for years, the state could not decide where to route the interstate. Would it go north of the city and avoid Charleston altogether? Would it skirt south of the city, or would it come through South Charleston, and elsewhere? The final decision was to put the interstate basically through the valley, which a number of historic resources, because much of the planning and the initial demolition was done either right as the National Historic Preservation Act was going into effect or before any local sort of regulation had been passed. Some resources have been lost, historic, archaeological, prehistoric as well, without a lot of record or mitigation being done. On the East End, we didn't lose as much as other neighborhoods. Of course, neighborhoods like the Triangle District, which is predominantly African American, they lost their entire neighborhood due to the interstate, the water company being constructed, and that's still a contentious issue with many African Americans today, that they lost their neighborhood due to this development. But the East End lost some structures on it would be the north end of the East End, along the base of Capitol Hill, Piedmont Road, that area, which was rerouted and redone. But very little mitigation was done, so there's not a real record of what was lost. And it'd be interesting to actually do a study of how many houses were moved, because I grew up on the west side, and I-79 took our backyard, basically, and I saw, it seeming, I was a kid, so I exaggerated everything, but it seemed that every week there was a house being moved on the interstate before it was open. The company that was doing the demolition work also moved the houses, which is very convenient for them, and they would move houses to different neighborhoods, East End, West Side, elsewhere. My favorite house on the East End has changed over the years as I've learned more about the neighborhood. This is an easy answer. Probably the Stevenson Tuvey house is one of my favorites because it is high Victorian. There is also the half timber house that I showed on one of the slides in the 1500 block of Virginia Street. Also is one of my favorites because even though it's an English Tudor style. My mother was German, grew up in Germany, and I've spent a lot of time in Germany. And that half timber style is reminiscent of my recollection of Germany, my mother's family, and wonderful times I've had there. So those are probably my two favorite. I'm developing more appreciation for more modest cottages, Victorian. The two Victorian cottages I showed, unpretentious, very, maybe it's, a sign that I'm getting old. I like things a little simpler and less cluttered and, easy to maintain. As a property owner, I'm always cutting grass, fixing leaking plumbing, whatever. But I've come to have a real affinity for smaller cottages. Craftsman style also, I think, more earthy sort of tones and style, which I like, which we also have a lot of. One thing we don't see in the East End, at least not in the original boundary of the district, are kit homes. If you get to the north side of Washington Street, there are some kit homes that were sold through Sears or Montgomery Ward or several other companies, which is a whole different presentation. But you could actually, between say 1905 and 1940, a person could go to the local Sears catalog and they could pick out a home that would be shipped to the nearest rail siding, and you would go down and either hire a contractor to pick up the material, which included everything, including the kitchen sink, nails, plumbing, toilet, windows, roofing, the whole lock, stock, and barrel, as they say. And you could either hire someone to build the house for you, and some of the kit homes are very ornate, Victorians, Georgian revivals, beautiful houses. Some are simple, but not all. Sears would finance your house, and I actually have a picture that I do in another presentation of a Sears credit application. It's one page. Name, address. Do you have a job? Yes. How much do you make? $3,000 a year, whatever it might be. You send that off, and within a week or 10 days, Sears would say, okay, you qualify for a house. And they would ship the house, and they said that a person with average building skills could build a Sears kit home in 60 days or less. I couldn't build one in 60 years, probably, so you would hire someone to do it, still saving money, but that was also very popular during this period in the early 20th century. We don't see it here, probably because the neighborhood was already developed, and folks who were building here had more resources, and they weren't necessarily concerned with saving a few dollars here and there. They wanted style, they wanted something that's going to last. To me, what makes the East End Historic District stand out is the range of architectural styles. The fact that it's such a diverse collection of, as I mentioned, practically every significant architectural style that was being built in the United States during that 50 years from the 1880s to the 1930s is present in the East End. Now, the long blocks also are significant because they are so unusual and rare. Whether they're the longest blocks in the world, we don't know, but they are quite unique. And it's interesting when someone tries to find our house. I say, just keep driving down the 1500 block until you're almost at the end, and it's a long one, and then they come to my house like, you're not kidding, it is a long block. But I would say probably just the diverse nature of the architectural styles that you see. There's something for everyone there. The Charleston Historic Landmarks Commission, of which I serve as chair, was established in 2007, 2008, and we are the successor to an East End group that was established in the 1980s to develop and then enforce the design review that exists in the original East End Historic District. The Landmarks Commission today, we meet monthly, and it's a 5-person commission that includes a historian, myself, 2 architects, and a realtor, and then 1 at-large community member interested in preservation and knowledgeable of development and things. And we meet primarily, we're still responsible for the design review, maintaining the integrity of the East End, the original East End district, but we also can offer opinions on other activities that affect historic districts around the city. And we currently have 5 historic districts in Charleston. I think that's right, including Luna Park. And the East End being the oldest. There is an Edgewood Historic District. There is an Elk City Historic District on the west side, Luna Park Historic District, and then Gross Cup, South Hills area. And that's the 5. There have been other parts of the city surveyed, but no action's been taken on creating a historic district yet. But the work never ends. And the interesting thing about historic designation is properties can be determined to be historic if they are at a minimum 50 years old. There are some exceptions to places that are beyond reproach historically, but 50 years old is the cutoff. So today we are now looking at buildings that were built in the 60s and pretty soon in the 70s for designation, including the first McDonald's in Downey, California, was listed 10 or 15 years ago, built in the 1950s. Not to say that every building of the 60s is worthy of being listed on the National Register. I would argue that many are not, but we shall see what the future holds. Oh, I forgot 6 districts. Yes, actually there are 6 historic districts. The Downtown Historic District, which all important that I left off.